Hello, I'm Thane Kreiner, CEO of Marin Agricultural Land Trust. Welcome to our second episode of Our Common Ground, a series of conversations about regenerative, inclusive agriculture and the future of food systems. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And if you're not with us in Marin County, I invite you to take a look at the website I just put in the chat and find whose native land you are standing on. At Marin Agricultural Land Trust, we acknowledge that our work and our conservation easements protecting agricultural land happen on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people of present-day Marin and southern Sonoma counties. This is land that continues to be of great importance to Coast Miwok peoples, and we seek to move ourselves to an organization that works with and for the Coast Miwok, celebrating and learning from their land stewardship of this area for over 14,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and all of its ancestors, past, present, and future. Thank you again for joining us. Our Common Ground is a series of conversations that explore issues related to the future of food and agriculture. And our goal is really to surface and center creative, innovative, and long-standing ancestral solutions to some of the most pressing problems and challenges. And in the course of doing that, unite farmers, ranchers, environmentalists, and other community members in imagining a future of sufficient and nourishing food for everyone, produced in a way that promotes a healthy and diverse natural environment and provides everyone involved in food value chains with dignified livelihoods. Our topic today is broadly ethnobotany, which is defined as the scientific study of traditional knowledge and customs of peoples concerning plants and their medical, religious, and other uses. We're broadening that a little bit to include notions of agroecology and indigenous wisdom, and really help shape a broader view of land stewardship and how we might access a diversity of knowledge to navigate towards a more just and sustainable world. So our goal is always to lift and center various perspectives and raise our ecological consciousness and our journey towards this future of food systems. With that, I'd like to have our panelists each introduce themselves briefly, and we'll start with Sky Road Webb, who's a Coast Miwok hoipu or headman and firekeeper. Sky Road, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Thane. Thanks for having me. I'd like to say open toish, which is our traditional greeting in Coast Miwok. And by way of sending a blessing to everyone, I'd like to say, Wali toish, mukayam kayanioko, which means blessings to all of you, or wishing great good to all of you who are my relatives. So I greet you that way. I'm my mother was of Coast Miwok descent. They're from Marshall there, the Tamales Bay Band. And I'm also a part of the Coast Miwok Tribal Council of Marin, and working to find a space that we can practice some of the traditional ways that have been left down for us, and use those traditional practices in this modern way. So I'm really excited about this conversation that we're having and how we can use traditional practices to manage the land. So thank you very much for having me.
We're really delighted to have you here, Sky Road. Keith Warner from Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, author of Agroecology in Action. Keith.
Hello, everyone. I am a Franciscan friar, and I am a longtime staff member at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, which is based at Santa Clara University. And Miller Center accelerates entrepreneurship to preserve the planet and to end poverty, which means in a practical sense that what we do on a daily basis is work with small community-focused enterprises that exist to create positive change in the world. We generally work with organizations that are located throughout the global South, but working on the front lines of the sustainable development agenda in Asia and Africa, Latin America. My relationship with ethnobotany really I trace back to back to the late 1970s when I dropped out of college and moved to southern rural Oregon, and I joined a Jesus Freak hippie commune. And as a part of that, I planted 500,000 trees over 5 years in the Cascades and Rocky Mountains. And that changed my understanding of reality. And it changed my understanding of what my own life project should be. And nature became not an abstraction or something I read about in a book, but it became deeply personal and touched my inner being. And it shaped the way that I understood what I was to do, because I began by thinking tree planting was a noble work. But I began to understand I was participating in this bigger system of ecological devastation by sort of greenwashing, covering it over. So this led me on a path of a lot of inquiry, trying to figure out, people don't like this logging, yet we keep doing it. How do we rethink this? We seem to be stuck. I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to pick up that story in a little bit later, but I'll pass it back to Thane now that I've sort of posed that question. How do we stop doing the things that are harmful, that we know that we don't want to do? What can help us out of that box?
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for joining us. And Rebecca Burgess, the founder and executive director of Fibershed, author of Harvesting Color, and a new book, I understand, coming out on Fibershed, and the great work that the community you have brought together is doing. Rebecca.
Thank you, and wonderful to be here with you all. And so, yes, I guess the piece which I feel would be helpful and complementary to lift up in this conversation would just be that the landscape provides, so it provides everything, everything that nourishes and nurtures, and that includes our second skin. And so we've been at Fibershed focused on ensuring that the conversations around ecosystem restoration, working lands restoration, whatever title is given to it at the time, that it includes an understanding that we need to think about, especially in agriculture in particular, that we produce natural dyes and fiber and necessities to develop our second skin. And I have observed with Fibershed's work, most of it has been on putting a plant, a four-legged, a two-legged face on the textile system to note that it's not opaque, that there are people, it's not anonymous, that we all rely on all of these communities of plants and animals, and just uplifting that alone has been a lot of our work as a public educator. But also we work on the restoration of working lands, and we take a very, I guess for this moment in time, it may seem like a broad view, but I think it's a very common sense view that agriculture includes the bulbs, corbs, and tubers that you mentioned, that Sky is connecting back to. It connects to the sedge, and it connects to the basketry materials, it connects to the natural dye plants. It's all one. And I think we've kind of thought that just there's one type of agriculture, but I really think it's stewardship of landscapes. And so we're really interested in telling those stories and all the material culture that comes from our landscapes.
Great. Well, it's really a delight and an honor to have you with us today, all three of you. And the format, for those who are new to the Our Common Ground series, is a panel discussion for the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for general Q&A. If you have any questions at any time, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your webinar interface, or into the chat, and we'll do our best to monitor both of those and weave them into the conversation, so to speak. So let's dive in, starting with you, Rebecca. Can you tell us a little bit more about Fibershed, how it started, your work in driving, what I would call climate beneficial agriculture, and your view on the concept of ethnobotany, which you started touching on, this notion that everything is connected. And I think we'll come back to that theme, this interconnectedness theme throughout today's conversation.
Sure. Well, it did start with me existing as a guinea pig for an experiment to wear clothing that had been grown, the fiber, the dye had all been grown within 150 miles of my front door, bathing suit, underwear, socks, everything, to try to see how I could reinvigorate relationship with place, with the local ecosystem. And in the process, I developed relationships with multiple types of land stewards, from tribes to the latest Euro versions of ag that have kind of landed on top of all of this other beautiful old history that I'd love to see more in balance with the rest of it. So we, in that process, have now developed an organization that looks at 51 counties in California, because what we've seen is that this community is actually very strong, and it was here already, and it just didn't have illumination. And it didn't have a lot of resources being applied to it. And so it was at risk due to people aging and culture kind of dissipating as technology takes over. I think we were at risk of losing a lot of actual biodiversity in these landscapes. It's, they call ecosystems, people call it sliding baseline. Every generation is like trying to protect something, but it's like we continue to slide further into more degradation, and we want to restore something at a certain point. But at what point are you trying to restore back to when you've had this slipping baseline for so many generations? We ask ourselves that question a lot, but in the context of fiber and dye, and how fiber and dye is really part of food systems. It's often the byproduct of the food system, in fact. So yeah, the work really started personally and then has grown into policy organizing work, community organizing work, manufacturing, economic development. It's kind of tried to hit on all of these pieces as we try to lift up a place-based economy again, because if we don't do it ourselves, we're unnecessarily putting burdens on other parts of the world to procure our material culture. And that taking responsibility is really the essence of our work.
Yeah, I really like that point. I mean, if the food, fiber, and materials that we can grow on our agricultural lands, broadly defined, don't come from where we live, they're coming from somewhere else. And how they're produced in those other places is something we all need to be really mindful of when we make choices about what we eat. One of the things that I like to say is that, many of us in Marin and Sonoma counties have the privilege of being able to choose what we eat and choose what we wear. And I think along with that comes a moral obligation to know how what we eat and what we wear is produced and its impacts on the environment and the people who produced it. One of the things I think we're all extremely aware of right now is the impacts of climate change. California's been in a historic drought, the worst in close to 100 years, since 1926 from the data I've seen. And then over this last weekend, we got quite a lot of rain, but all at once, essentially, half a season's rainfall in a couple of days. So these impacts of climate change seem to be accelerating. And before the drought and the rain, we had several years of really intensive wildfires. Sky Road, Coast Miwok have been stewarding land in Marin and southern Sonoma County since time immemorial, really. What can we collectively learn from Indigenous knowledge as we face this acceleration of climate change impact in terms of stewardship of the land?
It's a good question. There's a lot of talk about natives using prescribed burns in areas and to manage forest space and stuff. But I think it's an important point to remember that the concept of wilderness is a Western concept. The idea of a space that's untouched by man, untouched by actually that wasn't the way. When you see some of these spaces that are, they're just a thicket. There's, deer can't even get through there. And so it's not really good for anyone. And so we were stewards, and it's our job to manage that space to not just for one species, but for to manage that landscape and make it a home for a wide variety of animals, plant nation, animal nation that lived in there. And so we use that through burns, prescribed burns. We sometimes that'd be annually or every 5 years in certain areas, and you encourage certain things and discourage things. And so you create a park, really, and then you're more I don't know, resilient against bugs or infestations in your trees, and you're more resilient against wildfires, you know, so because the trees will be a little further apart and the underbrush would be out. And so so there's good management in that way, you know, just how we think about managing and stewarding and the environment.
You made a really important point there, Sky Road. Well, multiple really important points, but I think one that is hard for some people who consider themselves environmentalists to understand is that the land wasn't wild before European colonialists arrived. People were caring for it in very intentional ways and with a specific connection to it and integration of their lives with the land. And I think we'll want to dive deeper into that notion of ecological consciousness and different spiritual traditions. You know, the other point, which is something that there seems to be quite a lot of conversation about right now in Marin County that you made, is shared stewardship of the land, and particularly stewardship of productive lands or working lands, to use the phrase that Rebecca did, is a mode of fire protection and fire prevention. And I think that, you know, the notion that protecting farmland is a way to prevent fires is something I hope people will take away from our conversation today. Keith, in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis really talked about care for our common home and the impacts of climate change and our need to pay attention to those who are most marginalized, to what you might call communities of ethical concern. Can you talk a little bit about how you, as a Franciscan friar and your work at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, have pursued those questions of marginalized or vulnerable communities, and what we can do to foster a more sustainable world?
Sure, thanks. So I would just picking up on what I had said earlier, the sense of like we participate in these systems that are continuing to degrade the earth, and yet we have this at the same time we have this stated desire to do a better job, but we can't seem to get those two connected. For me, that was really important, an important kind of question that kept rubbing against me, and I kept leaning into my experience of feeling this deep sense of kinship with the trees and the forest and the creatures. And I realized over time that this, for me, was a form of prayer, a form of conscious, it touched me at the level of consciousness. And for me, as someone who's a Christian, I was struggling to figure out how do these things fit together. And I found in the person of Saint Francis, the 13th century Italian medieval saint, an example of someone who brought together what we might call nature mysticism, a sense of deep communion with creation, and finding that was connected to his sense of his religious faith. So for me, that was a really important breakthrough, and then that was what eventually led me to become a Franciscan and join the Franciscan religious order. Now, along the way, of course, my desire to foster greater ecological consciousness and work for social justice, and to bring forth that kind of that twin mandate of care for the poor and finding opportunities for dignifying the lives of care for the earth and dignifying the lives of the poor by giving them opportunities. I encountered along the way that, yes, Franciscans were involved in the colonial project, and I was very much taken aback when I began to realize this. That wasn't what I signed up for. Found out there's other things that get entangled if one is a member of a Catholic religious order, and that require attention. But I would say that for the purpose of this conversation, what I think is most striking is the way that the Pope, along with virtually every other major religious leader at the level of global human society, is giving a very consistent message of the need for transformation of our consciousness, that we need to find ways to reach people at a deeper level than just words, or even deeper than market incentives, as important as those might be and powerful. But we needed to find a way to engage people at the level of spirit, at the level of transformation of consciousness, for a greater collective effort. And that this is part of the reason why I came to Miller Center and found it to be an attractive option, because it was about taking ethical ideals and then forming organizations that had economic power around that, and trying to recruit many other people in this, participating in creating a form of economics that corresponded to our values. So for me, this idea of social entrepreneurship, using business skills and strategies to create positive social change, is a very attractive feature when it's married with this idea of ecological consciousness.
Thank you, Keith. Sky Road, in our conversations, you've shared some stories about the spiritual traditions of Coast Miwok, which I think it's kind of remarkable how resonant they are with some of the things that Keith just talked about. And one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of years is pretty much every spiritual tradition and science are telling us the same thing about the need to care for our one common home. Can you talk a little bit about some examples of the important plants and how they were regarded by the coast, how they are regarded by the Coast Miwok for food or fiber?
Oh, thank you. This is one of my favorite topics. I like to tell the kids a story about Oye Oyish, Old Man Coyote, who stole the music, which was from the Babbling Brook. And he went and he fell in love with it and he stole it. But of course, they all knew he had it because it was so loud. He was holding it. So he had to go try to find some place to hide it. And he found Elderberry, his friend. He said, Elderberry, hide this for me. And so, and he ran off. Choyeki the deer and Cooley the bear chased after him. When they got to him, he said, I don't got the music. And they said, we thought you had it. And then so he went back to ask Elderberry. He says, where's the music I gave you? And Elderberry says, oh, sorry, I ate it. So now Elderberry has the music. And so we plant elderberry and move that around to all our communities. We use it to make our musical instruments, our clapper sticks, a flute, other types of instruments. It's a very helpful tool. It's highly medicinal, and the berries, processed well. They're all parts of it are poisonous, but we knew how to process it for other medicinal properties. So there's a lot of and you see how the stories hold our culture together. There's other things that we like to manage I saw this up on top of what's known as Black Mountain there. And our word for that was Oyen Muchis. Oyen Muchis means coyote's bones, but Muchis is a special kind of bone. It's a hairpin bone or a nose septum bone, or it's a hand game bone. And we played a game where you try to guess which hand the marked bone is in. And so it meant his hand game bone. And so you can see he's kind of holding when you look at the Black Mountain now, you can see it looks like a paw holding a big bone. But up on top of there, I saw there were these, the brodeas, the blue dick flowers were up there, and mandrake root. And anyway, we have a story about those blue dick, the corms they produce. It's like a little, almost, it's kind of a starchy garlic kind of little tuber. And so the story is, again, Oye Oyish, he saw the children were hungry, and he taught them how to dig for and to find the corms. And some of the children were stingy, and they took all the corms for themselves and didn't leave any. And some children were generous. They took some corms and they left some for Coyote. And so Coyote cast a spell. And for the children who were stingy, they would only find small corms and wouldn't find too many of them. But for those who were generous and left corms behind, then they would find plentiful amounts of corms and lots of them. And so that's a teaching for us to be generous and to leave a little bit behind. And then actually the action there, those is developing and managing those cornfields all along those hills. We were working those tuber patches, and so that was our. So those weren't like wild tubers; those were our tubers that we were working in those tuber fields. And so anyway, we could go on and on like that. But just our relationship with like you see the oak tree was planted there. It's not wild. It's maybe they've gone feral now, but they were planted and tended, and and they had special oak doctors who knew how to treat them. and they were passed down because they lived from family to family, and those trees had names, and so so if you see some of these big oaks around here, it probably has an old name. We'll have to find out what it is. All right.
I'd love to know the names of some of the beautiful oaks that I've seen in Marin County. They're really gorgeous, and I'm sure that they have long stories that they could tell us. Rebecca, in the process of building Fibershed and the work that you've done, one of the concepts that you bring up really builds off what Sky Road just said, which is there's an immense amount of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge that has not been captured under the framing of Western science, but we can all benefit from it as we imagine a future of sufficient and nourishing food produced in a way in harmony with nature. Can you talk a little bit about this notion of relearning, and give us a couple examples of the things that you've relearned in the process of building Fibershed?
It's a great question. Well, just to think about my own ancestry coming more from the North Atlantic, Irish, Welsh, Scandinavian, a lot of the plants that connect continents, actually elderberry, yarrow. This was brought to my attention from one of our board members, Dr. Kat Anderson. She said there are these plants that connect us all. And so can you start to think about yourself, even though your family's only been, in this part of Marin County for 5 generations, which is not very long compared to Sky Road's family. What are the ways that I can, it's not my relearning process, but what can I do to support communities who because of the colonial project, they were severed from many of, not all, but a lot of cultural knowledge, was broken and injured in the process of the European settlement and the Spanish missions. So how can we be kind of thoughtful and really in tune with this big history that we're carrying? And so one of those ways to me is to make sure that we're putting those plants, we're tending those plants regardless of our ancestry, that we're caring for them, we know them, that we're building relationships. And ideally, I'm not a landowner, but ideally that landowners are thinking deeply about the potential and hopefully are implementing the reality of bringing tenders and gatherers into their land. I think there's the land back movement, but there's also a gradation of things that can occur, meaning land access, usufruct, tending rights. There's potential for all these kinds of ways for us to come together around the tending of elder, the tending of the sedge plants, the mugworts, the bulbs, corms, and tubers. So that's been part of Fibershed. I mean, there's many plants that we work with. Elderberry makes a great dye. It's also the music, that's the clapper stick for the traditional music that Sky described. It also is wonderful for riparian corridor restoration. And so Fibershed's been, looking at when you have work through EQIP, environmental quality incentives programs, dollars that come through this federal government, how can we kind of marshal and Aikido move healthy soils dollars that come out of the state or the feds? And as we're repairing creek habitat, as we're repairing hedgerow projects, how can we put those plants, that plant palette, back into the landscape? And so I think there's gentle and subtle ways and also very overt ways to do this work. And then my relearning too also includes, is mainly focused on relearning my own ancestral knowledge around plants, which is more flax production, wool production, and then understanding the impacts of wool production in California and how that has been kind of a big counterpoint to the health of like indigenous foodways. The inclusion of sheep in California is not a good history, but it's part of my family's history. So I have to reconcile these things and live with that, but also through plants and animals, I learn my history. Through plants and animals, I learn what's important to tend, and I can only do my best, an awkward best often,
Wow. I
But
think
yeah,
you're doing a tremendous good, and I think the raising of our, collective ecological consciousness is something that hopefully we can all do more of, and take collective action towards building the world that we all want to live in. And MALT's world, we protect agricultural land, but we also have programs to help steward it in terms of creek conservation and creek restoration, exactly as you're talking about it. And I think since I joined 6 months ago, one of the things that we want to pay more attention to, and the reason that we reached out to Coast Miwok, is to learn how we could do that in ways that are more respectful and centering of the indigenous knowledge, and the variety of different forms of willow that there are, for example, and the importance of each of those in weaving. So, we each have some examples of how to express the ecological consciousness. Keith, can you talk a little bit about a practical expression of this related to innovative social networks? Because I think, to transform how we produce food and fiber and how we steward the land, it's really going to take networks, and it's going to take collective action and learning what works in different areas, and then adapting that to the particular ecological and social context. So I'd love to hear a story from you on a practical expression of ecological consciousness from your work.
Sure. I would say that as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of my adult life, I was thinking about this question of communities of ethical concern, and I couldn't quite figure out what to do about it. Well, one thing led to another, and I eventually ended up studying for my doctorate. I studied the title was Agroecology in Action: Social Networks Fostering Sustainable Agriculture. And I looked at, interviewed literally hundreds of people involved in California agriculture who were trying to make incremental progress towards more ecologically informed forms of agriculture in California. And I found that so much of that wasn't just the people working the land, but they had to be connected to a whole host of social and ecological and economic relationships to be able to make that transition possible. But from my work at Miller Center, a more recent example, which I think might be illustrative here, might be a good example, is actually taken from the other side of the world. Several years ago, a network of Catholic sisters in East Africa approached Miller Center, when Dane was the executive director there, and asked us to develop a leadership formation program for them. There are, in 10 East African countries, a total of more than 30,000 Catholic sisters, and they come from the villages themselves for the most part, and they seek to work with some of the poorest people on the planet, especially disadvantaged youth and young women. And so, but they felt like they had very little to offer the people around them that were in even greater need. And they knew that charity models didn't work very well, and they were coming to an end. So they wanted to adopt a social enterprise model. So with Thane's beneficent leadership, myself and several other people were able to put together some programs that were allowed the sisters to start poultry production systems, enterprises that would engage, train, and employ local women and youth in the production of food. And one of the things that I was surprised to discover in that context is, like, the eggs and the poultry meat sold like hotcakes. In that context, there's actually there's a pent-up market demand for this. And so the sisters themselves, of course, brought a lot of credibility in this more traditional society, and they were seen as trusted agents in the business realm. But what's really exciting about this is the way in which they were able to create opportunities for young adults, especially women, that would allow them entrance into the first steps towards farming in a way that they could feed themselves and support economic activity in their local community. And again, this notion of communities of trust and the sense of being able to work together on a common project that allowed this to come forward. And I would, just to make the connection to plants, the sisters are now engaged in growing feeds, growing grains that then they turn into feed that make this possible. So you see in this context, this whole notion of people, that we need people who can gather others in community to be able to make the land society relationship healthier.
Thanks, Keith. Just to remind all of our listeners, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A there. Keith, I want to build on your comment about bringing young adults into it, and it's something that I think Rebecca has thought a lot about in her work at Fibershed. How do we bring in community into this notion of ecological consciousness, Rebecca, and in terms of relearning and then carrying forward that sort of knowledge in ways that we can all be better stewards of our shared home?
Is that a question for Keith, I, and Sky, or would you
That's
like
for you, Rebecca.
That's for me. Okay. I would say yes. So the ideas put forward just now, that of intergenerational knowledge transfer is really what we're trying to do. And I think Sky shared with us something. I always find, like, when I listen to Indigenous leaders speak, Indigenous community members speak, that they just embody like multiple stacked realities that like my brain would tease out into like 10 different things and say, science shows us that, sociological studies show us that, but like it's so integrated, it's hard to even, I would say, for a lot of Euro-Western trained people to even appreciate. But that story you told about the bone being held by the coyote, to me, that essentially is knowledge. You're transferring knowledge through story, and you're building a cultural continuity through joy, through visual imagery, through being able to sit around a fire, to tend the fire, to listen to these stories. I'm imagining those stories are told around fire, or they're told out on the landscape. To bring back knowledge transfer in that integrated and joyful way is really ultimately what I think is so important. I even heard an educator that I respect say, we're just still experimenting with this idea of like Western education. It's still a new model. This idea that you just have kids sitting there listening, sitting in desks. As someone who's studied brain plasticity, I really think that we do a disservice to children the way we're trying to transfer knowledge at current. I think there is landscape level education that's sensory rich, that will help us, I think, bring ecological literacy into our culture at a much deeper level when we break some of these chains of what we think of as the right way to educate. So but I've done some of that work to do curriculum development and also bring children onto landscapes. My work has pulled me in so many directions in the last 10 years that my work was seated in outdoor education, and it's moved into economic development and what Keith is discussing, which is how do you bring eco-spiritualism into like basically an economy? So you're not doing harm. But essentially, I think that is the most important human question. And so I have not been able to spend all my time educating children, but I would say that's where the meat of the work is. I wish I could do both.
So Sky Road, I think this is probably a good time to pose a question that's on a lot of people's minds to you is, how can we recenter and relearn Indigenous practices for land stewardship, and how do we get young people and old people out onto the land and learning Indigenous wisdom?
Thank you. We have hopes of building a cultural center, a cultural learning center, and be able to share some of this knowledge. We don't really have a spot in Marin yet, but that's one of the things we'd like to do. I have to say, Rebecca, there's another story we have about Waylon Oppie, which is the prairie falcon. And he is sent on a task by Oye Oyish to go fly out east to see the Star Sisters, where he acquires a piece of the elderberry. And he has to buy it from the Star Sisters. It was one of the Pleiades sisters and the Morning Star for sure were mentioned. Anyway, so he has to get has to buy it with some clamshells, and he brings the elderberry back and plants it. So again, there's stories throughout all of our that hold the fibers together. I think one of the things we're also talking about is how, when you talk about economy, well, you know, if the Western mind had seen the oak tree as a viable food source, not just a cabinet or a big frame for your boat, then there might have realized what a plentiful food source that it is, and then also that oak is they didn't realize is oak is just like cornerstone for the whole environment. You know, it feeds everybody, the moths, the bugs, the birds. It's just such a cornerstone. So, but we weren't just on the oak tree, and not just the acorns, also all the tubers. We mentioned those. There's soaproot is another beautiful plant that provides glue. Probably you could process it into things like that replace plastics, you know, and it's also the fibers that are available in it as well. There's other things that we were eating. Pinole was what the Spaniard called it. We had a mixed grain bread, kind of like a granola bar, and it was wild grains gathered out. You know, there's so many wild grains and grasses, and they were using our winnowing, which is highly inefficient. We knock seeds everywhere, and we spread it around, and we bring those seeds back, and we make our little granola bars or type of breads or whatever we want to do. So there's so many other, food options out there. And if we saw the native grasses as also a potential food source, then we would be more inclined to provide more space for them. Is it a job? Yeah, man. Bringing all these wonderful plants back, encouraging them to encourage the fullness of the environment, the fullness of the home for everyone. All the birds love it, the deer love it, the squirrels love it, and all the other little plants that have these delicate relationships with each other that we only know a little about, are allowed to do. Just one more pitch. You mentioned sedge. Sedge is an important, delicate little grass. It grows along the riparian zone. Hardly worth mentioning, but it's like a beautiful plant for basket weaving, which is this, the California, arguably the Coast Miwok baskets were the best and finest in the world. The California natives have really specialized in basket weaving. And there's so many wonderful basket weaving plants. And, I hate to say that that's a dying art, but man, who's weaving beautiful baskets anymore? And we had found a way to use baskets for everything. We didn't even use pottery, even though we could have used pottery. Baskets are the way to go. You can cook in baskets, even with hot rocks, and you can carry your stuff and you can port it. And it's not something that is lasts for 50,000 years. It just it'll just melt away when you're done with it. So anyway, thank you.
This notion of really circular models of production and consumption that you're talking about with baskets instead of plastic containers to gather and store food, I think is a really important one. And you also brought up this idea, which Rebecca and Keith both touched on, that by diversifying the kinds of plants that we grow on the land, we can reap a lot of different benefits and create productive, meaningful work for people in producing our food and our fiber locally. So Keith, you are responding pretty visibly when Sky Road was talking about some of the models of production. Did you have a comment there that you wanted to jump in with?
Well, I mean, I will just say that I am a lover of native plants down here in San Benito County, and I live on a property that allows me to plant lots of them. And I'm nodding my head because Sky Road is taking it a step further beyond beauty to practicality. Yeah, and so I think that there's there continues to be each year a greater awareness of the value of indigenous plants from a perspective of water conservation, and that's good, but that's not as good as it could be, as Sky Road points out. It's like these are economically useful plants and culturally valuable plants, and that should not be something restricted to the historical past. And so then I think that building upon the interest of native plants, how do we use that as a way to help us recenter and learn to love where we are even more?
Yeah. So great thought there, Keith. And one of the questions that we have in the chat here is about, you talked about indigenous plants versus world plants or invasive plants. At what point do we accept, the question is, at what point do we accept a plant that is not native into the landscape? And how do we make that decision if it has medicinal use or other practical uses? Rebecca, do you want to take that first, and then maybe Sky Road?
Sure. I definitely I'm visualizing myself pacing my house trying to answer this question about 8 years ago, because I think frankly it's not really for my ancestors to answer that. Like I'd really like to hear more from how, because my ancestors saw the landscape and brought crops and plant life that they had genetic experience with, they had breeding experience with. And so I don't think my ancestors were paying very much attention to oak, as Sky said, as Keith says, as an economic value. Like it was cut down for tannic acid for tanning hides by the Spanish. And then it became, yes, cabinets and all that. So when I think about invasives, I mean, when I review my own thinking around these plants, I think, is this plant limiting a potentially diverse plant community? Is it pushing out plants that could provide more native bee forage, more human food and medicine, dye, fiber, more protection for four-leggeds, more forage for four-leggeds? Is this plant, like French broom in our area or Scotch broom, is this plant inhibiting a diverse oak woodland? Is this plant inhibiting that in any way, shape, or form? And I would say in our watershed, Scotch broom and French broom which were brought in during the railway development to prevent erosion in railway corridors, have completely gone off the rails, in my opinion. And I'm not alone. It's not good for erosion. It doesn't preserve the oak woodland. It destroys it. It's a fuel ladder, and it creates catastrophic fire. It's like my least favorite plant, but I harvest the heck out of it for dye. So I'm like, the best thing to do with these plants that reduce diversity and inhibit other species with collaborative or more coexisting relationships, this plant tries to erase that. I'll harvest that back. I'll use that for dye, and then we'll see what comes in on the heels of that. Or if I have more time, I will replant the perennial bunch grasses. I'd love to see more native plant nurseries helping us get genotypes specific to regions. Mm-hmm. And I would really love the bulbs, corms, and tubers, the Yampa, Paradoridia gardneri, the blue dicks. I would love to see more access to this plant material so we can restore at scale after we remove the invasive. So yes, I do. There's a few that I'm like troublemaker plants that I go after for sure. But ultimately, I do think that is up for a big discussion, because the last thing I'll say is the European oat. Sky, you can tell me if this is true, but I heard that was also harvested and used by native people because it had so much sugar content, but it's totally denuded the carbon in our rangeland systems, and which means our water holding capacity is not as good, and it's destroyed our perennial bunch grass communities. But these things are complicated.
So we have thank you for that, Rebecca. So you pointed to something that came up in the chat here, that people are saying, Sky Road, they would love to have a list of the plants. And it comes to Rebecca's point about the genotype, which ones are really the ones that belong here in Marin County. And in my conversations with the Coast Miwok, I've learned that where the willow comes from and the exact kind of willow are important culturally and that they have meaning. So the question is there a way that we can find that? And it kind of relates to another question there, which is what are the prospects for land in Marin being made available for return to Indigenous practices? So would love your thoughts on both of those kind of points. And I think it connects with this notion of, Rebecca's looking for where can we get plants to do the restoration. I know MALT is thinking about very much the same thing as when we're helping restore a riparian zone. How can we do that in a way that's respectful and centers Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous plants? So over to you, Sky Road.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like what Rebecca said, it's a complicated issue on some of those points. I just wanted to add a plant that I discovered out here in the valley up near Davis, and there's some reservation area that I'm at, and there are these the devil's claw comes out, pops out in the heat of the summer. In July, it's the only thing beautiful flowers. And I was like, what is this when I first saw it fly? And then it comes out and it's got this wicked claw that comes out. And so I started doing some research on the devil's claw, and it has a native story. The Pima and the Papago down in the desert Southwest are known to propagate this plant. And they actually, I say genetically, but through breeding, bred them for longer claws and tastier seeds, and the fruiting body is edible, tastes like a mild turnip, and all parts of it are medicinal. The roots have this great medicinal quality. Anyway, this then was traded all the way up through into California, and the Miwok here in the valley, because it's warm enough for the devil's claw, are known to use the devil's claw in their baskets as well. And so you can see we brought them in. we brought them, but we brought these native version of them. They can tell by the type of seeds. And so anyway, we brought some invasives in that we liked. And now, I mean, if you ask these cattle ranchers, they don't want to see any devil's claw out there in their field for sure. But so, what point is it, it could be an early trick we laid for everybody. But what is you were talking, what is I think you asked so many questions in one question there thing, but I do want to mention, we talked about the willow, and I always think about Tokoloma, that little village. It's not much of a village now, but it was the community there. They're at Lagunitas, and there's the road overpass, and that little community was that means willow basket, or it's the fish basket willow, and is the name of that. And so that area, and you can see there's willow all along there, and that willow was for making the fishing basket. So it's a weave of type of basket, kind of wicker basket design, and we bred that, tended that. We didn't just let it go crazy. We would trim it back so it grows in straight lines and work it so that it does. And you wouldn't want a whole lot of willow there, because that would suck too much water, but you have the right amount so that you can make your willow baskets. I think those guys are the ones that are still hanging out over there. But as you come up to that intersection, you look over there, those are probably ancient willow variety. So where's the list? You can look at some early ethnographers, Seahart, Merriam, Heiser. There's some of these guys that did and really got in there. And there's another book by Isabel Kelly, the interviews with Tom Smith and Maria Copa. They really went through and asked all the, as much plants information as they could, and they did their best to try to get the species down what they could on that. So there's some resources out there of what they were. I haven't seen it put all together in a nice package that would be like, hey, here's your new planting guide, but that might be an interesting project. Yeah. And as I look, it's funny that there's stories that do pop up about each one of those. Of course, they're not. Someone asked for the stories. I don't know where they all come from. They haven't been written down.
Well, it's the oral tradition. So, as follow-up, we are posting the episodes of Our Common Ground on our website, and they're being rebroadcast on KWMR. And what we can do as part of that is pull together some of the resources that you mentioned, Sky Road and other resources for people. I see references to Larner Seeds. The question that I don't think is fully answered is what are the prospects for land in Marin being made available for return to Indigenous practices. And that's something that at MALT, our mission is to permanently protect Marin's agricultural land for agricultural use. But I think this conversation really reveals the breadth of agriculture that we can consider as part of that mission. And it's something that is very high on our radar screen in terms of strategic discernment. So we're coming near the end of our time together. And what I'd like to do is give each of the panelists just a quick minute or so to share some parting thoughts with our audience. And then I'll make a few final comments. So why don't we start with you, Keith?
Yeah, I'd like to recommend that everyone find a way to care for native plants, and to do so in a way that allows them, not just as a tactile, visually rewarding activity, as valuable as that is. They are beautiful. There's a way in which the appreciation of what their gift is to us can touch a deep part of ourselves, and can open a part of our consciousness, our awareness of ourselves, and to help us to learn how to love our earth, because loving our earth is fundamental to all of these things. And with that opening of our heart can open our minds and help us to work together towards the kinds of common goals we've spoken about today.
Rebecca.
I second that, Keith. And that's similar to what I was going to say, is that I'm visualizing a patch of Paradordia gardneri, like the native sweet potato and the native blue dicks and some of the Calcordus species. And I'm thinking of these beautiful, like the return of the mosaic patchwork of wildflower gardens that Carl Purdy recognized when he was on a railway line between, I think, Marin and Sonoma. He said, "What's this beautiful mosaic patchwork of wildflowers?" No, they're tended agricultural landscapes. It wasn't a park. So I'm thinking about, the idea of some of our rangelands and our large landscapes, the MALT lands. It's a lot of work to do that. And so I think we need to respect, like, whomever is willing to do that work. Like, we're all in this together to do this work of stewarding, because it's a lot. I mean, if you go and try to build back a native grassland, you know what I'm talking about. So I like Jessica Poncha's, that she's asking that in the chat. What are the lists, and how can we look at erosion control, carbon sequestration, food stock for animals? Where can we create synthesis so we create enough intrinsic motivation in our community to accomplish this work of tending large landscapes together at a watershed scale, and ensure that native communities are centered in how, and then also bringing back the relationship Keith said of the use, the bringing it into your soul. Like, there's, and so I know that's sacred territory, but if there's a willingness to share, which I think we have to earn through the support of tending, and I think we can all participate in that tending.
Excellent, thank you. Sky Road.
I just got to tell you one little short story. So about Oye Oyish, he had a vision that the stars were actually holes in the basket of the universe, and that must mean that the sky people are hoarding the fire and light in the basket on the other side. And so he sent Kalupi, the hummingbird, to go up into that little hole and to steal some of the fire and light and bring it back down here, so we could have fire and light down here. So Kalupi does. She flies through there. She gets a hold of a big old pile of Chewa light, a Wookiee fire, and she's, "I'm going to take this back to the people." And then one of the sky people says, "Look, Kalupi's trying to steal the fire. Let's get her." And they threw a lightning bolt at her, and she comes burning down out of the sky, carrying as much as she can. When she gets down, all she has is one little ember under her chin. And that's why the hummingbird has that red throat still today, from carrying that fire down for us. Well, so they're all so excited now that Kalupi has stolen the fire, but Oye gets all excited and he reaches in, he grabs that ember, goes, woohoo! Of course, it was hot. And he starts hopping like this. Oh, and the sparks start flying. A big spark fell into the buckeye tree, and he starts hooting on the spark were flying in the mule fat, and some spark fell in the willow, and some spark fell into elderberry, and some landed over in this little plant called mare's tail. And not everybody knows all the places. But you know that if you get two of those together and rub them together, those plants will bring your fire back out. And so, there's fire out there in those plants. There's medicine out there that have been brought down for us, and it's hidden there. And the plant people are keeping it secret until we ask it of them. And that's why I like to say, Wali Tosh, Mukayam Kainiko. Blessings to all of you.
Thank you all for joining us today. Our panelists, I think, have done a phenomenal job exploring multiple dimensions of ethnobotany. And our next episode will be at 3 o'clock, not 4 o'clock, on November 10th, looking at the issue of food justice. So thank you again. And this concludes today's episode of Our Common Ground.